I always like to begin these sessions by acknowledging that we live and work on the traditional territory of the Atawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and that the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which was land that was promised to the Six Nations and includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. And I find it's increasingly and always important to acknowledge the territory that we are enjoying. My tremendous pleasure today to introduce Sharon Megdal, who's the director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center, a research and extension unit in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at the University of Arizona. Her work focuses on water policy and management, and she's a very frequent author and speaker on these topics, and she holds a long list of titles: professor and specialist in the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Science, the C.W. and Modine Neely Endowed Professor, and a distinguished outreach professor. She's currently the director of the University of Arizona Water, Environment, and Energy Solutions Program, which is funded by the University of Arizona Technology and Research Initiative Fund. Dr. Megdal's work has a large geographic scope, ranging from local to international. Current projects include comparative evaluation of water management, policy and governance in growing water-scarce regions, groundwater management and governance, groundwater recharge and transboundary aquifer assessment. She's the lead editor of a book, Shared Borders, Shared Waters, Israeli-Palestinian and Colorado River Basin Water Challenges, and is the lead guest editor for multiple special issues of the journal Water. And today, she's going to share her experiences by talking to us about connecting research and practice around groundwater governance. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Megdal.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, the Water Institute, for inviting me to speak and your hospitality. And I've enjoyed my stay, short though it is, and actually have enjoyed the crisp weather. In Fahrenheit, we're already hitting 90 plus degrees in Tucson, Arizona, where I live. So this is a nice change and enabled me to wear a sweater. I hardly wore the whole winter, so it's really a pleasure. I have a lot I want to talk about today, and I'm going to watch, there's the clock, to keep it to 45 minutes or so we have time for questions and the like. And I was asked to talk about some of the work that I've been doing in groundwater governance and management. And then also, when I said, here's a list of some of the things I could talk about, one of the things on the list was connecting researchers and practitioners. And they said, well, can you maybe combine those two? And so I'll come back to some points related to the second part of my title toward the end. And some of that may become evident as we go through the talk. I want to notice that throughout the talk, I sprinkle in the website for the Water Center. It's at the bottom of that title slide, as well as my email address I'll have up at the end again. And I believe you'll be posting the presentation or whatever, so people can feel free to contact me. And our website is a very good source of information for Arizona water issues and also some of the regional water issues, and certainly the projects that I'll be talking about today. So just first off, I've already talked a little bit to Kevin and Rob and others about the water centers. So we have our own small building. We're slightly off campus. Any of you been to Tucson, Arizona? Have you been to Arizona? Yeah, a few. We're in the old Boy Scouts building, and anybody here a Boy Scout remember what the motto is for the Boy Scouts? Be prepared, and I often say that's a good place for a group working on water management, particularly in a water scarce area like Arizona, to be located. And there's our mission statement. So from the looks of it, I think many of you here are students. How many are students in the audience? A lot of you. And I teach a class in water policy in Arizona and semi-arid regions. And I use this slide not only in class, the first class, but also many of my talks. And you know, I think it's obvious to us what we see in terms of water policy and practice depends on a lot of factors. And I just list some of them here, and I underlined a few of them. Clearly, the legal framework determines what we see in terms of the practice of water management on the ground. And then centralized versus decentralized decision-making, and that will come through in basically, it's a fundamental part of my presentation today. Politics and public values clearly are connected, and all sorts of other things. But then I note the importance of context. And I talk to people about, I didn't put up my hydrologic cycle slide, you know, no new waters created, that's an important context. But then the geographic context is, of course, important here. And I put up a couple maps for you just to show you where Arizona is. I don't always assume people know where Arizona is. In international groups, I will sometimes say, you know, we're located near California. People tend to know where California and Los Angeles are. But we're located in southwestern United States along the border. We share a border with Mexico. I'll talk about some of our transborder work a little later. And we depend on the Colorado River for about 40% of the water supplies used in our state. And so the map on the right shows the boundaries of the Colorado River Basin, and you can see just about all of Arizona is in the basin. 7 states in the Republic of Mexico share the waters of the Colorado River, and waters are also transported from the basin to farming areas to the west, Los Angeles area and San Diego, Denver, Salt Lake City. And so this is an important part of what we talk about and what we worry about in our region, because about 40 million people in the United States depend on the Colorado River in some way, shape, or form. So this is just a little bit of context for where it is I work. And then just a little bit more, and I'm going to show you a few slides down, yet another map of Arizona. This is our Arizona water map poster. Kevin, this is what I left, a folded copy for you. We also have a flat copy suitable for framing. But this is something that we developed at our center to put out a map that focuses on the water features of our state. And then this blow up to your right shows within the state the different degree of reliance on groundwater. And so I mentioned that the Colorado River supplies 40% of the water to the state. Groundwater supplies about 40% of water to the state. And then there's some other surface water supplies and reclaimed water that also supply water. And the kind of aqua-colored, teal-colored are groundwater basins that depend on groundwater for over 75% of their water supply. We have communities in the state that are 100% dependent on groundwater, and most of that groundwater is fossil groundwater, so it's not being replenished even close to the rate at which it is being utilized in some cases. So this talk will draw upon a significant amount of work that I and several others have done relating to groundwater governance and management. The list on the left just shows a couple of the areas in which I work. I'm not going to be talking about recharge and water banking. That's something we do a lot of in Arizona. That's a different talk for a different day. But I am going to talk about the second two, the groundwater governance surveys we've done and some case study analysis, the U.S.-Mexico Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program. And then in general, the fact is working on groundwater is somewhat challenging compared to surface water in that you can't see it. It's invisible. And a lot of times people don't know, period, where their water is coming from. But in terms of groundwater, very often people don't know how much is even there. They're using it, they're relying on it. They don't know how much is there. And there's been a number of efforts in the last few years that have tried to increase the visibility of groundwater as an important water source and one that requires quite a bit of attention. And so I have a column throughout this talk, or occasionally through this talk, I show a snapshot of columns that I write. I write for our newsletter a quarterly column, and they're usually a page or two long, and those are accessible if any of you want to go back to them for any more insight after the talk. They're available on our website. So what do we mean by groundwater governance and who thinks about it? So I'd like to point out that in recent years, last 5 to 6 or 7 years, there have been multiple international efforts to focus on groundwater, on water governance, on transboundary waters. And I know two of them up there. There's a groundwater governance project that was funded by the Global Environmental Facility, carried out by people from the World Bank, FAO, UNESCO, International Hydrologic Program, that tried to identify good practices on a regional basis for groundwater governance. Around the same time, just a little bit later, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, the OECD, which is made up of members from developed countries, Canada's a member, United States a member, undertook a water governance initiative that continues to do its work in outlining good practices for governance. But water supplies, and particularly groundwater supplies, tend to be quite local. And so how they're governed and how they're managed will vary a lot. And I'll show you some of the results of our survey in a few minutes, but the question comes up, what do we even mean by groundwater governance? And I provide for you a definition that we developed in a paper. The paper, the snapshot of the paper title appears there, is groundwater governance is the overarching framework of groundwater use laws, regulations, and customs, as well as the processes of engaging the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. This was taken, a modified version of some other definitions, but often there's confusion. What do we mean by governance? It's more than just government. Okay, government often is the body that's determining the laws and the policies, but this is more than government. It is a collection of all kinds of regulations and customs that could include more than what the government is prescribing. And it also includes reference to processes of engaging the public, the civil society. Groundwater management, I simply describe as more of the what we do. So the governance establishes the framework, the management is what we do. And so an example of that that's very close to home for me is that we may have statutes, legislation that authorizes a system of water banking underground. It may have oversight by a department of, let's say in our case, the Arizona Department of Water Resources. It's a framework, but nobody is necessarily mandated, or entities are not necessarily mandated to do the banking. They may choose to store water underground as a management decision, and we have that going on quite a bit in our state. Through the talk, I'm going to highlight some challenges in some of this work as I go along. And one of the challenges to highlight here is there are about as many definitions of governance as there are people offering those definitions in papers and projects. So you'll see definitions that are 2 and 3 sentences long, but they all tend to refer to basically what we tried to capture there in one sentence. Now, I want to talk a bit about U.S. groundwater governance. And I should know this, but how many provinces do you have here in Canada? Just 10? Just 10?
3 territories.
And 3 territories, okay. See, I should know that, but I don't. We have 50 states, right? And then we have the District of Columbia that may be its own, but I'm not going to mention them here because they don't really rely on groundwater. And then we have some territories too. And the federal government exerts very little authority over water management. Now, there are water quality standards set by the federal government for discharges into rivers and streams. There are obviously safe drinking water standards that the federal government sets. But when it comes to the actual water supplies and how they're managed, and particularly groundwater, the states really hold the authority to determine how they wish to manage their groundwater resources. They may themselves abstain from management. They may delegate management to sub-state jurisdictions, but it is at the state level that the management is done. Surprisingly, perhaps, or perhaps not surprisingly, we don't have really good inventories of what the practices are across the states. And even the water experts tend to be experts in their state, maybe in a region, but even academic experts. There's just too much to try to compile and categorize, and it's always changing. So if you create an inventory, it'll change. But we undertook an effort, and we started with the initial survey, as we called it. We were ambitious. We thought it would be initial, and we'd have more surveys. And we, in fact, do have one, but maybe not as far-reaching as we hoped back in 2012 when we started this effort, was we wanted to get a sense of what's going on in the states and what are some of the issues in the states. And this was a self-funded study, so we didn't have a lot of resources. We and a grad student went to work on this, and we basically reached out to water experts at the state level, so in your case it would be at the provincial level, at the province level, and asked them some questions through a survey. And I'm going to show you some of the results that we have mapped pretty quickly. But why did we even want to do this? I mean, why do it? Sounds like busy work. I just told you it's going to change all the time. It's going to be hard to get comprehensive information in a survey. We had limited resources. Well, it goes back to one of the efforts I mentioned already, and that is this groundwater governance effort that was trying to look at groundwater governance practices across the world. They were holding 5 regional consultations in different parts of the world. And I'd been to, I was part of kind of like an advisor to the project, not a paid advisor to the project. I'd been to a couple of the 2 of the first 4 consultations, and what I noticed was that you often had things described for an island state of maybe 40 to 80,000 people as a state, a country that was being characterized. You also had large countries that were being looked at. And sometimes when people would put up maps of water scarcity, water availability, and these are often worldwide maps. Of course, I'm focused on the US here, so I'm remembering what they would put up for the US, and it would all be one color for the US. So, you know, it might show blue as relative lack of scarcity when we know parts of our country lack water resources relative to demands in a significant way. And so rather than paint the US with a single brushstroke, we know that there are differences across the US, and we wanted to help people understand that, especially as we were coming up to the consultation. It was being held, we've talked a little bit jokingly today about the Netherlands. It happened to be held in The Hague, that was covering the US, and I believe Canada was included in that one, and the European countries. Mexico was included in a different one that was dealing with the Latin Americas. But we know that there are differences, and this just happens to be dependence on human needs as met by groundwater based on USGS data. And so you see the darker blue is where there's a high dependence on groundwater percentage-wise relative to the lighter blues where there's much less dependence on groundwater. And so we know it isn't all one color, and even with a state, it's not all one color. So this is my home state, Arizona, where we adopted in 1980 a very progressive piece of legislation called, not surprisingly, the Groundwater Management Act. And we created areas within the state, these colored areas in the central part of the state that are called active management areas, where we had significant population centers or centers for agriculture, and groundwater was being used at a much higher rate than being replenished. That was in 1980. We're now many years, 35 years beyond that, and other parts of the state are experiencing some stresses to their aquifers and drawdown that exceeds recharge. But those tan areas of our state are areas where there is no regulation of groundwater at all. So even within states, we're an excellent example of how there can be differences within states. So we did this initial survey, and these are some of our general findings. And I'll show you some slides in a moment that attempt to either show in bar graph or map some of these differences, but I'll let you read that and I'll just highlight a couple of things. But clearly the groundwater governance priorities vary by state because states rely on groundwater to a different degree, among other reasons. There's significant variance in the connection between surface water and groundwater. I mentioned the hydrologic cycle earlier. We all know that surface water and groundwater are connected, but laws often don't recognize that connection. It may seem illogical, but that's how they are. And so that's how you see some of the regulations emerging or evolving that don't recognize that connection. And we saw quite a bit of difference in agency capacity to carry out policies. So let me just show you a couple of graphs here. This was just a simple question: to which of the following user groups do groundwater regulations pertain? And so you could see, we surveyed 50 states, and in this case, the District of Columbia. You always have some non-responses and so forth, but only 20 of our respondents said irrigation associations are subject to the regulation. Domestic wells tend to be the individual property owner, individual wells. Very often they're exempt from any kind of regulation. What tools do these water agencies use? And you can see for water quantity on your left and water quality on the right, you see that there's a lot of use of permits. But notice like pricing. Well, you don't tend to price issues on groundwater quality. Nobody responded that. But only four of the states indicated that they were in some way or other attempting to use pricing in a way to manage groundwater use or quantity. A lot of monitoring going on, but even for certain sectors where they do regularly monitor, they might not monitor all the sectors, such as agriculture. In the state of Arizona, agriculture is monitored when it comes to water quality in a different way than obviously municipal systems. Now, these are a couple of graphs that I'm going to show you to show you some things that even people who work for agencies were surprised. So we asked, do separate agencies deal with water quantity and quality? And look how few are the light color that says it's the same agency. Most have separate agencies. We tend to have a Department of Water Resources separate from a water quality agency. Very often the water quality is dealt with in an environmental agency that may be dealing with air quality, solid waste, and other things, such as in Arizona. I had a member of the staff, very experienced member of the staff of the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, who's a hydrologist. When he saw me present this, he said, I had no idea. You might think that the different agency people talk to each other across the country in the US. They don't that much, even with conferences and so forth. So that was a surprising result to him. How accessible is groundwater information to the public? And notice that these light colored ones says somewhat accessible, where the other ones were, kind of extremely accessible. Arizona is one that does a lot to make it accessible when it exists. Sometimes the data don't exist, and so they were really referring to, in my opinion, when it exists. This was an interesting question that we did ask. Does state law recognize the connection between surface water and groundwater? In fact, when we started this initial survey, we were going to ask a lot of questions about the laws, but then we figured the recipients of the survey might get kind of annoyed at us because you can look up laws and you can do that on your own, but it's very time consuming, and again, we had limited resources. So we asked some basic questions, and so we got no answer from a few. Those are the whitish ones. We got the yellowish, goldish ones saying no, and the blue ones saying yes. But it was interesting when I presented this to a meeting that was of practitioners of dealing with water quality. I had a representative from the state of Nebraska, which is here, say, well, yes, we do. Your answer's incorrect. And I said, oh, well, we just surveyed one person. What can I say? So as I was going around and talking with people, or if I met somebody from Nebraska, I would ask them, we had this survey question, I was told our response was wrong, and they said, well, it's because it depends who you ask. Because they have a separation of surface water management from groundwater management. It's done at a different level of government. And so it shows that with a simple question, you can't get into the nuances and complexities. And so I usually don't use this slide anymore and show it, but for today, I wanted to show it to show that there's a lot of complexity even when you ask a question that you think should have a simple yes or no answer. And this was one of them, that it requires further investigation. This is an interesting map that it overlays the state's responses to whether they have sufficient regulatory capacity to enforce groundwater priorities. The dark color is no, we don't believe we have sufficient capacity. And then the overlay with the hatches, which might be a little difficult for you to see on the dark, shows the states identifying declining groundwater levels as a priority. So you have many states that have responded no and show the hatch marks. They don't have sufficient capacity to enforce groundwater priorities. And yes, declining groundwater is a problem. So that tells you you have a problem with the approach to groundwater governance in those states. And then this was a map we put together a little bit after, as we wrote a chapter for a book that came out in late 2017, an edited volume, where we did an overlay of states that face a potential critical condition in their groundwater resources, and more than 30% of human needs are met by groundwater and declining aquifer levels. So interesting, you see some prominence of some areas in the Colorado River Basin and the Ogallala Aquifer area, and areas that have a significant amount of agriculture going on. And then this is the last of this series of maps from this study. This is that same one I showed you before, sorry. Just to show the challenge, I didn't realize I had that in there twice. A challenge with this study, I think, is obvious. We had a single respondent, and we need more responses per state for validation and assessment. And we did get some validation in the second survey that we did, but that also, as I'll mention, had a single respondent. And the reason we have not been able to do a more in-depth study is that we haven't been able to get the grant funding to do it, because we really need external funding to do that. And it's interesting, just as a little maybe editorial comment, is that in the US at least, it's sometimes hard to get funding for a study that has kind of national implications, because people tend to be more interested in the regional and local, and there tends just to be more interest in funding some of the more, let's say, technical type of studies, rather than a survey that helps expand the state of knowledge, but doesn't get into modeling and some of the other things that some of the funding agencies like to study. But that's just, maybe our proposal writing was not as good as it could be, so I'm not going to make excuses if that's the reason. So we undertook a second survey in the 2016 to 17 timeframe that focused on groundwater quality. And I said we didn't get the funding we would have liked to for a larger study, but we did approach some of the folks who were going to serve on our advisory committee for that larger study and said, we'd really like to do some more work. Let us know if you are interested in some additional work being done. And this Groundwater Research and Education Foundation, which is connected to an organization called the Groundwater Protection Council, which has as its focus in the US water quality issues, particularly water quality issues related to gas and oil development. And their foundation gave us a limited amount of funding, so we undertook a second survey. And in this case, we decided we were going to target water quality agency people. Remember that map that I said there's separate agencies? And the first one tended to target the water quantity agencies. In this one, we looked to the water quality agencies. Our survey had 67 questions. That table shows you the representation of the respondents. This one was a little harder. We had a couple of states that we just had a problem getting responses from. So from a survey design, we don't have homogeneity in the type of respondent as much as we would have liked to, but in our opinion, it was better than not having any response from the state. And I actually gave a webinar back in last May already when we had one state as a holdout. We just couldn't get anybody there, despite our networks and other things. And when somebody saw my presentation, emailed me immediately afterwards and says, oh, that's terrible, nobody from this state responded, and I'll make sure that we get you a response. It was somebody from a university. So that was Florida. I tried to make them anonymous, but I just now realized that I didn't update my slide. I'm sorry, Florida, but it was Florida. What can I tell you? I'll have to update that slide. And here are the collaborators and our advice. We had a project advisory committee that was extremely helpful in testing our survey and helping with some of the survey questions. So that was great. I'm just going to show you a couple maps from this one, in part because lack of time, but also because we've hesitated posting this study, which was completed last June, on our website. It is available if somebody would like me to email it to you. I will do so, but because we have an article that's under revision, publication pending, just as a little tip, I don't know, Rob, is this something you teach in your class? But if you want to get an article published in a journal, don't post all the content beforehand on the web, because they are honestly trolling the web. A different article that I co-authored, they came back to us because it was based on a study that was posted on the web, and they just wanted to make sure that it hadn't been published anywhere. And we could say, no, it hadn't been published in another journal, but some journals don't like it if it's posted at all. So we've hesitated to put too much of this up until our article is posted. But this is just showing the #1 ranked groundwater concern by state. And you could see quality is that lighter blue, is a highly ranked concern. Quantity in some states, and then private wells. I believe we might have had a check off and then other, and this is what people showed us. So quite a bit of variation in their #1 rank concern. We then asked them, what are your top 3? Not forcing them to give us a top one, and we have figures that report on that. And then what is your #1 ranked groundwater contaminant source by state? And agriculture with the nitrates and other things is a clear one of important. Industrial and mining, and wastewater related and other. So, and again, we have lots of different results graphed. We also asked about unconventional oil and gas exploration production. Again, I mentioned that this Groundwater Protection Council and this foundation, some of their members are involved in oil and gas production. And you could see that the dark is the states where it's occurring and regulated. The white are those not occurring because there is no potential. Arizona is an example of that. And then other states it's not occurring for other reasons, where in certain states it's actually banned, at least at the current time. So so here's some challenges with this one. Again, single response per state. It was tough to get responses, as I mentioned. And I mentioned networks. My center is part of a national US network. Our Groundwater Protection Council members that were on our advisory committee had networks. And so they're often good to rely on, but even sometimes your networks fail you and you don't get the help that you need. And then one of the things that we had planned to do in this, and we had a short 7 or 8 question survey, was that we wanted to go to the regional offices of our US Environmental Protection Agency and see what they had to say, but in a much, not 67 questions, but more overview type questions, to see about whether what they would state about their regions, we have 10, I think it is, EPA regions in the US, to get some federal validation. And again, speculation on my part, this validation exercise happened soon after the beginning of this year. And there was a change in administration, questions about changing leadership and so forth. So we don't know whether the lack of response was for that reason or people are just tired of getting questionnaires from university people or whatever, but we weren't able to do that. Okay, so here are just some other findings here. Some of the things we asked them, what they see on the horizon over the next 10 years. There was a lot of concern about budgets and personnel and just not having the resources to carry out some of their activities and just the non-integrated management. How much of it is left to local counties, in our case, versus state level in terms of monitoring and the like. Okay, so moving on to a little bit about a case study. So one of the reasons why we undertook the survey is that case studies, which are common, are useful and they're interesting, but they can only go so far. There is, as many cases as you have. Sometimes case studies can be a listing of, the situation in the cases. I had a small grant, some limited grant funding, and I decided to undertake a study of, and as you can see from the title, we were looking at 3 high-growth regions in the Sun Belt. We missed Texas. Had I known we were going to use this title, it took a lot to figure out the title. For the paper, I might have included Texas in there, but again, this was a small study. And we took 3 areas that we were somewhat familiar with. One in Arizona, but not the real populated area of Arizona, where they'd done some innovative things, including an auction for effluent rights. We looked at Southern California, the Orange County Water District, which is a major user of managed aquifer recharge to meet its water management objectives. And in fact, they do reuse, indirect potable reuse of treated wastewater through their storage and recovery system. And then we looked at the Orlando, Florida region, which is an area that I had been invited to as part of a stakeholder workshop where they have a very large Floridian aquifer, but they also have limited ability to reduce flows in rivers because of environmental concerns. So they have some e-flow type regulations. And there they were getting concerned that permits, groundwater use permits, might not be renewed the next time up because of the concern of what was going on with pumping and that this could limit growth in the area. So we undertook a case study. We had the article published in early 2017 in Journal of Environmental Management. And then some lessons from this were, and in all these cases, we knew there were regional approaches. There were sub-state approaches, either delegated to the districts or regions by the state. In the case of Florida, their motivating goal was, we want to avoid litigation. We know we have some problems. We don't want to get stuck in the courts, and the only people who tend to benefit from that are the lawyers. Any lawyers in the group? But there's some truth to that, and their motivation was, let's get out in front of this and figure out what we could do. And so, the conclusions, regional approaches are needed because groundwater resources don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries, so a single city like City of Orlando, City of Prescott, Arizona, aren't going to be able to tackle these issues on their own. That sometimes you had to have newly configured boundaries to your collaborative approach. So in Florida, they have regional water districts that have a lot of authority over carrying out the state's groundwater and surface water regulation. Well, this Orlando area, the greater Orlando area, covers parts of 3 of them. So 3 of them had to get involved. It wasn't just one that they could go to. Water management innovations will arise out of the need to meet the water needs of a region in the context of the legal framework. And so in Arizona in particular, we have certain requirements for an assured water supply in these active management areas. Water supplies, natural water sources are scarce. There's a community that realized that the effluent it was treating and then recharging had some value. There has been an effort to import some groundwater from another region through a pipeline, and the auction of these effluent rights to developers or for the use of for development brought in potentially a large amount of revenue for them to then use to construct this pipeline. So all this interrelationship, surface water or effluent, surface water, groundwater, and needing funds to build infrastructure. The robust stakeholder engagement is key. In Orange County, where they're reusing effluent, they spend years working with their communities to prepare, to educate, such that when they deploy this system of recharge, staying underground for a while as an environmental buffer, recovering and then serving that water as part of the potable system, there was no hue and outcry. It's actually quite a success story. In Orlando, they tried to deal with the stakeholders and move from what was just a nascent effort when I interacted with them to now, if you go on, it's myregion.org or something like that, and they have a grants program, and they have a very active look at what to do in the region to address some of the water challenges. Also, there is value to sharing best practices for regional cooperation, opportunity to learn from each other for what's being done with groundwater, which admittedly is a very local resource. Now the challenge here, and again, some of you are grad students, either for your dissertations or with your dissertation or thesis work or afterwards, you're going to be interested in publishing. And so, you start and embark down a project and try to think about writing an article, even with just 3 case studies. It took us a long time to figure out the way to weave this together to make it a kind of coherent journal article. We kept coming up with ideas of how to frame it, and like 2 out of the 3 would always fit in and not the 3rd. And so, case studies are great and they're important, but to draw something from them may be a bit more of a challenge. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears for a few minutes and talk about the transboundary groundwater along the US-Mexico border. And I could spend the whole, I could have spent the whole time talking about this. It's a very, very interesting project, but I'm just going to highlight a few things about it here. Many communities along the US-Mexico border are 100% dependent on groundwater. And these 4 highlighted areas were aquifers that span the border that were determined both by the US through an actual act of the US Congress signed by the president and Mexico to be of priority to look at. And so there was agreement to take a look at these aquifers together, but just from an assessment point of view, because the potential management of aquifers across the US-Mexico border is quite complicated by legal and institutional issues, not the least of which is this delegation or just the rights of the state to manage their groundwater, govern the groundwater regulations, and the federal government having to get involved when it's country-to-country kinds of negotiations, and our states not necessarily wanting the federal government to interfere with and get involved. So there's lots of barriers to actually doing something with respect to binational management of groundwater, but unless you're at least kind of on the same page with assessing the condition of the aquifers, you can't even get to talk about management. And so before this, typically what you would see is US would have maps and characterizations that would end at our border with Mexico. Mexico would have characterizations that would end at their northern border. So the idea was to take a look at trying to come up with a consistent story and understanding of the aquifers. Again, we have very different approaches to the regulation. I have a paper on this if anybody's interested, but water governance is very centralized in Mexico. It's, as you know, decentralized in the US. At our border with Mexico, we have an International Boundary and Water Commission. Up here, there's a joint commission, I think it's called, dealing with US-Canada issues. And the IBWC, which has a single commissioner for the US and a single commissioner for Mexico, has a long, long history of dealing with binational surface waters like the Rio Grande, Tijuana rivers, Colorado River, some wastewater issues, but very little involvement in governance. So we had to deal with, at the outset, this asymmetric governance system, different units of measurement, different languages, different cultures, all kinds of things when you're dealing with two different countries. It took us a couple of years, not that we were working all the time continuously, from the authorization on the US side of our authorizing statute. The United States Geological Survey was the lead federal agency authorized by the statute, and my water center and my sister centers in New Mexico, Texas, California opted out of this program. We were written into the legislation as partners, which is a unique federal university type partnership. I'm not aware of anything like it in other fields, other water areas or anything. It took till 2019 for the principal engineers from Mexico and the US to sign this cooperative framework. And I put this in here. I'm not going to be able to read all of this, but it's a 3-page document. We spent 2 years on it. I think it was time well spent, because as I look back at it, now that we've conducted some of the studies, we've worked together, what we did was really put some very basic principles that were essential for us to work together, to have the mutual respect of each country's sovereignty, of different approaches. And I think that this framework, this cooperative framework, is a model for transboundary studies, assessments of any kind of water, and probably in many different areas. And basically those points say nothing is taking away from the sovereignty of this. I don't know if anybody here follows any of the UN resolutions dealing with international waters, but there's been a draft resolution on transboundary waters. This is very consistent with the information sharing and respect for sovereignty. And if you notice, number 6 basically says this information doesn't bind us to do anything when it comes to management. And you say, well, so what are you doing? But again, I go back to the fact that in order to even talk about management, you have to agree on the conditions of the aquifer. There's a very nice partnership between universities in Mexico and the US, the International Boundary Water Commission, the National Water Agency, and the US Geological Survey. And at the end of 2016, we finished the assessment for the San Pedro aquifer, the one in blue to your right, of the 2 transboundary aquifers studied along the Arizona border with our state to the south of the border, Sonora. And this is fully bilingual. It was published in English and Spanish. The maps are fully bilingual. And this is the first study of this type that was adopted by the International Boundary Water Commission, both sections, US and Mexico. And we've put together a bilingual fact sheet, a 6-page fact sheet, and a lot of effort went into the mapping to try to harmonize the maps across the region whenever possible. There were a few cases where we couldn't do it, but A grad student of mine right now who had done her master's at the University of Sonora has been key in doing this mapping, and it's really been an important part of this exercise. So what some of the challenges of this, as I mentioned, were culture and so forth. I've talked about the challenges along the way, but there are lots of challenges, but you have to think about the opportunities as well. And many of these challenges can be overcome, but it takes time, funding, persistence, cooperation, and teamwork. And these are just a few photos at the outset of the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment for Arizona Sonora. We had a workshop that was really helping us determine the agenda and the fact that we wanted to work together. And we have advisory committees, a lot of meetings. These are held under the auspices. These were the two gentlemen who signed that cooperative framework. They're held through the auspices of the IBWC. But over time and working together, we've actually developed very, very good working relationships. So, last part of my talk is talking a little bit about connecting researchers and practitioners. And I put together a few things, thinking that there would be a good number of students in here to just talk about as kind of maybe a little bit of tips of the trade when you are doing real-world-based research and projects. It doesn't have to just be research, it could be projects. And it takes really good communication skills and the right communication vehicles. When do you want a one-pager? When do you two-pager? Is 6 pagers too much, or is it what you really need? When it comes to, and like acronyms, I realized as I was going through here, like I tried to take out acronyms, but I left in EPA. I'm here in Canada. Everybody might not know what EPA is, but I was running out of room on the slide, so I didn't write it out. But not using acronyms is really, really important. What and where to publish? And so in academia, there's a tremendous focus on journals with impact factors, right? So that's all very important and very good, and it's something you need to do. But if you're working with real-world people, they're not going to read those journal articles. They may read a one-pager. If you really want to have impact, you've got to think about the right way to communicate. So there's multiple kinds of impact to consider. And oftentimes when I'm speaking with academic audiences, I say, your bigger impact, if you want to impact society and policy, might be with something other than the journal. But it also goes the other way. If you want to impact the state of knowledge in the field and future research and everything, you actually have to publish in those journals too. Because very often, people don't find it if it's gray literature, if it's something posted on the website. And in certain environments, might it be the courts or other government agencies, if it's not a peer-reviewed journal, they're skeptical of it. They might be skeptical of it even if it is a peer-reviewed journal. But the point is, it goes both ways, and so I think people really have to think about multiple ways of communicating the findings of results. Showing up is important, just showing up. There are meetings, there are gatherings. Sometimes you think, oh, why do I want to go, or whatever, I'm busy. But showing up shows you have interest, and they'll remember that. And it gives you greater access to people. They might be more responsive to your emails if you're asking them to share information or to serve on an advisory committee for a project. And advisory committees for projects are extremely important to get the advisory committee early in the process, not after you're about 1 day from submitting a proposal and so forth and doing so. Despite what I said about networks not always helping you out the way you'd hope they do, take advantage of existing networks. People may know somebody, people may be willing to make an introduction for you. The value of networks is extremely important. So spend lots of time communicating and networking, and that, these are somewhat repetitive, be willing to give your time. It's just very important. And so I have just a couple of 1 or 2 more either snapshots or slides. This is one a public policy review, learning about water policy. I take my class each spring on a field trip. This was spring of last year. And this is a photo of from actually some different times. And one of these had a number of visitors from Mexico with us who joined us. In fact, this is the next photo will show the bigger group with Mexico. This is an example, those commissioners I told you from the International Boundary and Water Commission, they know that I've done work in the Middle East. They'd never been there. They asked if I would help kind of work on a trip for them. And it worked out that we went there a year ago to Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank together. And here are the two commissioners, the US commissioner and the Mexico commissioner. And it was an amazing way to make connections across the region and share information. Not part of my job description to be an international tour planner, but really, the second time or more than I've done that, it's really, really valuable to build those relationships. I mean, there's nothing actually like that. And here's an example of, and these were all snapshots of columns I've written from last spring, where some individuals from Mexico were very interested in our recharge policies. They wanted to come back, a whole group of them, a few had been there, and I said, well, I've got my class field trip. Maybe you can join us. It worked out. There are some farmers who host us for lunch at a great dude ranch. And, you know, I could call them up and say, well, how do you feel about having a dozen more people come to lunch, you know, from Mexico? And they're more than gracious doing that. Again, because of the time and relationship spent. So that's the conclusion of my prepared remarks. I took a little bit longer than the 45 minutes. I'm happy to take questions. Here are some acknowledgements. I put up some snapshots of some articles. Anything that we can post on our website, we do post. If it's a copyright protected journal article that we can't, we'll have an abstract with a link. And we do have some additional publications in preparation. So I encourage you to take a look if you're interested, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sharon.
Hi, I was just wondering, in your comparison between how groundwater is managed in the US and Mexico, you said that Mexico was more centralized. Is that more effective in your view or in your experience between the two?
Oh, so that's a really interesting question. Is the approach in Mexico more effective because it's centralized compared to the decentralized? I'm not sure I have enough information to be able to make a gross conclusion. When it's centralized, at least, let me just bring together surface water and groundwater and not even talk about kind of geographic centralization. That, of course, is going to be much more helpful than not. You hear complaints about water regulation wherever you go. So I hear complaints about in Mexico. So I would just say wherever water's scarce, we've got challenges. And you just can't make a blanket conclusion on, not just a cop-out, but I think it's true that you can't make a blanket conclusion that's one is better than the other.
Hi, I'm Frederick Peters from the City Institute at York, and forgive me for being more of a political scientist here than an hydrological expert. But circling from that question, which I think is really crucial, are alternative regulatory frameworks even in question in the United States? You know, with surface water, river catchment basins have become the norm under the Water Framework Directive in Europe. We in Ontario share that lovely border with New York State and Vermont, et cetera, et cetera. It does work relatively well, despite last year's flooding around the St. Lawrence River. Is that a possibility? I mean, I understand that aquifers don't really care about what state they're in.
Well, so I think we're all searching for more effective ways to do our groundwater management. And let me just mention California for a moment, because California is a huge state. You know, it's the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. It's got major agriculture municipalities and the like. And this is an example of where, we did that initial survey in 2012-13. Well, in 2014, they adopted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that really is attempting within the state to look at surface water and groundwater together. And it's amazing to think that California really had no groundwater regulation until 2014, one of the major states. Now, they had other programs through bonding and other things that were trying to incentivize kind of a holistic look. And this new approach is requiring plans to be developed by basins or sub-basins that look at the integrated view. And in some cases, they're going to pretty small geographic regions. And so I think that people are looking for ways to improve, but it goes back to you've got to get the people to agree. And so one of the things that a lot of people are saying now, I'm not the only one, is that often the barriers to improved, let's say, water management, they're not technological, they're not even financial, but they're people related, getting people to agree what to do. And so I didn't say it, but I'll use this opportunity to say it now, is that because of the different approach of the US and Mexico, when the authorizing legislation was approved by the US Congress, it had words in it that International Boundary and Water Commission shall be consulted as appropriate or as necessary. Well, they became integral to the whole thing because in the US side, they didn't really have any history of groundwater. On the Mexican side, basically it is Mexican policy, law, whatever, that any water along the border must be approached through the Mexican section of the International Boundary and Water Commission. So if it was going through the IBWC on the Mexico side, it had to go through the IBWC on the US side. But there are just such differences in the starting point on this very issue of, an integrated look by basin or whatever. And, the IBWC has seen great cooperation on Colorado River issues, on wastewater issues. They just haven't had the experience with groundwater. And I just think it's going to take us a while to get there, just being a realist. But I think people would like to see different kind of approaches. But take the Colorado River Basin. If you talk about catchments and basins, it's huge. And there's so much variation and, subsets of aquifers. You can't do it at that big level. And, interstate gets very tough. So we'll just have to see, Yeah.
Hi, thank you. That was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering, a few years back there seemed to be quite a bit of excitement that a collaborative agreement between Nevada and Utah was going to really trickle out and have some big implications for sharing groundwater and cooperation in the United States. And when it wasn't signed, ultimately, after it had been negotiated, I was just wondering, it was hard to tell from the outside, how did that ripple through to people's perceptions of the collaboration between states and what their options were to avoid federal interventions?
So the question about cooperation between states, I can't speak to how people kind of felt about it in Nevada and in Utah. Clearly, it's disappointing when things don't come to fruition, but there tends to be very significant, continuous collaboration across the states in the Colorado River Basin because of the shared Colorado River. And we have a divide between the upper basin and the lower basin. So Nevada's in the lower basin, Arizona, California. Utah's in the upper basin along with Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico and Utah. And so they may not get together as often, but I think everybody, I would have to say as a generalization, people act as professionals and they work together, and if something doesn't pan out, they're going to keep working maybe on something else. And these issues of sharing water, let's talk about it. We're by the Great Lakes here. And what did the Great Lakes do? You know, they adopted, you know, we're not going to share our water with anybody, worrying about maybe Arizona or other areas eyeing water from the Great Lakes. There's still talk people bring up about, well, the Mississippi-Missouri system, you know, they have flooding. Maybe a solution to their flooding is to somehow get the water out to the thirsty Southwest. So these issues of sharing water resources are really, really tough issues. And so I don't know enough about that particular agreement, but I'd say the people continue to talk to each other. And I do want to say one thing that I didn't say, but your introduction, welcome, made me think about, and I didn't put the map. Sometimes when I put the maps of the different colors, I put up a map showing the tribal lands in Arizona in a gold color to show another example of, let's say, different authorities. In the United States, when it comes to water, tribal nations are sovereign. So the state of Arizona has a Groundwater Management Act. It doesn't apply to tribal nations. Water quality, such as drinking water quality standards, will, but tribal nations will have their own, not all do, but they will have their own Department of Environmental Quality or water management and the like. And so that brings additional complexities. We've had many water rights challenges, and some of the settlements that are done outside the courts and then the courts sign off on it address groundwater issues and pumping of groundwater in areas. So that's another trans-border type groundwater issue that we didn't even talk about that's also significant. And those discussions and issues, you know, those can get very tense, but they continue. And sometimes they ebb and flow, to use a water metaphor, I guess.
It's interesting you mentioned that you also went to Palestine and Israel and Jordan. So it's a very interesting experience, I'm sure, that you had, because what you've mentioned, you've worked between the Mexicans and the Americans and sort of seen that. So, and on the other hand, you worked with an occupied versus an occupier setup. So how was that as an experience, especially that, you know, some of us here know about the situation in terms of aquifer distribution, resource distribution between the Gaza Strip and you know, Israel and the West Bank as well, and Jordan. How, if you would like to comment on that just a little bit, what you learned?
Sure. And I have to say, one of the reasons why I went on that trip and the commissioners approached me is that I've been going to that region many, many times over the last, particularly since 2010, but for over a decade now. And every time I go to that region, I learn different things. And the issue of the water resources is obviously quite challenging, and because, like Arizona, some of these areas are landlocked areas, and so they don't even have a sea next to them to consider desalination. And I have to say, I can't speak beyond anything I read in the newspaper about Gaza Strip, because I haven't visited there and talked to people directly. But we held a workshop back in 2009 involving Israelis and Palestinians, and it gave rise to this book I edited that came out a few years later. And the time it got the most tough, contentious, was when there was discussion starting on the mountain aquifer. So the mountain aquifer is an important groundwater source for both Israel and the Palestinian territories. And there is clearly disagreement about the deal that got struck some years ago about the A, B, C areas. I think there's great challenge there, in part because as the Palestinians, and again, this is me speaking on my own, as the Palestinians look to formation of a state, they do not want to be dependent on another country such as Israel for their water supplies. And that means there's a lot of work to be done in that realm. And there are cooperative agreements. The Red Dead project involves water going over to the Palestinian territories. And from my interactions over the years, I believe that I didn't talk about wicked problems. Have you talked about wicked problems in any of your classes? I see a nod of the head. Wicked problems have all kinds of other things that are influencing whether they could be solved. Well, the political issues there sometimes interfere with the water sector people from working things out. And I think if the water sector people were not so interfered with, maybe we could start approaching a better situation, but there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, you know, how much more can I say in a couple minutes, but there's a lot of work to be done. Yes, and I will say, though, one thing very important with the commissioner's visit, so the commissioners went there because they said they wanted to learn about the region. My reason for wanting to get the commissioners there was because I felt that they had a really good story to tell, a very important story to tell about how they've been able to cooperate. Two countries with unequal economies, different languages, different cultures. And it's a model because they are located near each other. They can get together in person. Their offices are just across the border from each other. They get together. They're actually friends, the two commissioners. Their wives came with them on the trip. And part of the message was, you know, in Israel, the Joint Commission's not even been meeting for 5 or 6 years dealing with water. And so if people aren't meeting, if they can't get together and talk to each other, that's a significant barrier to improving the situation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So please join me again.
Thank you. Thanks.